Hey guys! Tonight we're diving into a journey that's equal parts fascinating and a little unsettling: the world of women in the Middle Ages. When daily life was more backbreaking than binge-watching a 10-hour medieval drama. Picture the glow of firelight on smoke-blackened rafters, the creak of wooden stools, and the endless shuffle of skirts over dirt floors. It's quiet, but not restful, because every woman you meet is juggling so many tasks that you almost feel tired just watching. Honestly, if you had to keep a household going without running water, electricity, or, let's be real, a decent coffee machine, you probably wouldn't last 5 minutes. Or at least you'd cry into your wooden bowl of porridge. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love picturing all the little pinpoints of light across the world tuning in together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself at dawn in a thatched cottage where a woman stoops to coax embers from last night's ashes. She's stirring the coals with a bit of iron, shielding her hands with a scrap of cloth, and whispering a prayer that the fire catches, because if it doesn't, the family's breakfast is cold bread and nothing more. The hearth is both her prison and her kingdom, a circle of heat where meals, laundry water, and even medicines must be conjured. You hear the hiss as she pours water into a blackened pot, the rising steam already fogging the air so thick you imagine her hair smells of smoke for life. Outside, roosters crow, but she doesn't step out to enjoy the fresh air. Instead, she sends her daughter to the well, down a muddy track, balancing a wooden bucket heavier than a toddler. The girl stumbles once, sloshing water on her apron, and her mother scolds her sharply. You can almost hear the muttered thought, "Why couldn't the boy have done it?" Except the boy, her brother, is still sleeping, because chores divide unevenly here. Women carry not only water but the invisible weight of expectation. By mid-morning, the cottage smells of boiling cabbage, wood smoke, and wool. Laundry steams in a wooden tub, scrubbed against lye soap that burns the hands. Imagine trying to keep white linen clean when your street is literally a mud track shared by pigs. Spoiler: it's never white for long. But stains matter, because neighbors gossip about who keeps their linens respectable, as if fresh sheets were the key to salvation. Historians still debate how often medieval people bathed. But one thing's clear: women bore the brunt of keeping households clean by standards that were nearly impossible. Later, she kneads bread dough with the strength of someone who doesn't get to call bread carbs, but survival. The rhythm is soothing, but you catch the glance she throws toward the door. The Lord's steward might appear, demanding dues, or neighbors might stop by to borrow a pinch of salt. Even simple food feels political, a balancing act between feeding your family and keeping obligations. You realize her day is a web, threads pulling in every direction, none of them her choice. And yet, humor creeps in. She jokes with her daughter about the chicken who lays eggs only when she's not looking. She grumbles that the cat does nothing but steal milk, though secretly she strokes its head when no one watches. In those moments, the endless labor feels almost human, almost bearable. By dusk, she's back at the hearth, stirring a thin stew, her face lined not just by age but by smoke and fatigue. Her children gnaw bread crusts. Her husband stumbles in smelling of ale. And the cycle begins again. You feel the ache in her bones, the weight in her shoulders, but also the stubbornness that keeps her upright. This is survival disguised as routine. And as you sit in the corner of that smoky room, you realize medieval women didn't just carry baskets, buckets, or babies. They carried the entire invisible scaffolding of life, one exhausted breath at a time. The next day begins the same way, with the scrape of iron against embers and the soft groan of timber beams. But this time you're not in a cottage. You're standing inside a bustling medieval town, where women weave through narrow streets with baskets balanced on their hips. Voices echoing off stone walls. The air smells of fish, horses, and smoke, a perfume that no medieval candle could ever mask. And at the center of it all, women are the glue holding everything together. You pass a market square where women spread out their wares. Herbs tied in neat bundles. Cheese wrapped in cloth. Wool spun into skeins that catch the light like threads of moonlight. Their voices overlap in a chorus of haggling. Part song, part battle. One woman insists her onions are worth double. Another swears her saffron came from Spain, though you suspect it's just cleverly dyed marigold. You grin because some things never change, like sales pitches that stretch the truth further than a medieval waistband after feast day. But beneath the lively chatter, you notice the tension. Women who work in markets aren't simply helping out. They're running the economic heartbeat of their households, often because their husbands are absent, off at war, in a guild hall, or sometimes simply too drunk to bother. You hear one woman mutter under her breath that she'd rather face a miserly customer than her husband's temper. That's when it strikes you. These stalls aren't just places of trade, but small acts of survival and defiance. Historians still debate how much independence market women truly had. Records show fines for women who shouted too loudly, sold after hours, or even stood in the wrong spot. Authorities wanted order, but the women's voices carried anyway. You imagine them as a medieval version of street performers mixed with Wall Street traders, except their stocks were eggs, cloth, and gossip. Deeper into the town, you find craftswomen tucked into shadowy workshops. A widow repairs shoes with hands toughened by leather, while her daughter threads beads into a rosary. A brewer stirs a frothy vat of ale, the scent sharp and yeasty, while a child dips a finger in for a cheeky taste. Alewives were common, brewing in kitchens and backyards, but also scandalized in chronicles. Men accused them of watering down beer or cheating customers. Funny how women doing business always seem to attract rumors, whether in the 14th century or today. And then there are the unrecorded labors. Invisible but everywhere. Women mending nets by the riverbank, washing clothes in icy streams, carrying bundles of firewood taller than themselves. Their backs bend, their fingers crack, and yet they keep moving. Because stopping means falling behind in a world with no safety nets. You notice how even the smallest girls mimic their mothers, tugging at sleeves, practicing the rhythm of work as though childhood were just a rehearsal for exhaustion. Still, laughter punctuates the air. Two women joke about a neighbor who insists her cow produces more milk after she sings to it. Probably the cow just wants her to shut up. Another quips that she'd rather face the devil than another day with her mother-in-law. Humor becomes armor, as sharp as any blade, cutting through monotony and despair. By nightfall, torches flicker in the market square. Women sweep up husks, fold cloth, and herd children homeward. The stones glisten with spilled ale, and voices soften into lullabies hummed against the noise of taverns. You step aside as a woman passes, her arms full of bread, her face half-shadowed but steady. She doesn't look like a heroine carved in stone. She looks like someone carrying an entire world. Unnoticed. And as you trail her down the cobbled street, you realize that medieval women didn't just exist in the margins. They were the pulse of markets, the memory of households, the quiet force that kept towns alive, even if the chronicles barely whispered their names. The street narrows. The air thickens with the scent of damp wool and hearth smoke. And suddenly you're inside the hidden world of the medieval household. It's quieter than the marketplace, but the weight here feels heavier, as if the very beams above your head are bowed with expectation. Women don't just work here, they're the structure itself. The invisible architecture that keeps everything from collapsing. You watch as a woman kneels by a spinning wheel, her foot pumping rhythmically, her hands teasing fibers into thread. The whir of the wheel fills the room, a sound so constant it's like a heartbeat for the house. Behind her, a girl no older than 7 stirs a pot hanging over the fire, the steam curling around her face like a veil. Childhood here isn't about playdates. It's an unpaid internship that starts the moment you can hold a ladle without dropping it. Meals are not just about feeding stomachs. They're about survival math. A woman carves out portions of bread so carefully you'd think she was calculating taxes. Which, in a way, she is. Misjudge the rations, and the family might go hungry before the next harvest. You can almost hear her mutter the medieval version of, "Do I look like I can make this stretch till payday?" And then comes the care work. The kind no chronicle ever bothers to mention. A baby cries, and the mother lifts him with arms that look strong but tired, rocking him with a rhythm that's part lullaby, part prayer. Next to her, an elderly grandmother coughs into a cloth, and the same woman pauses to adjust the blanket at her shoulders. In one breath, she tends to the future and the past. If multitasking had a medieval patron saint, she'd be canonized by now. Historians still debate how much authority women had inside their households. On the one hand, the husband was legally head of household. On the other, he often wasn't even present, gone to fields, guilds, wars, or taverns. In his absence, women managed money, directed labor, and made sure the place didn't catch fire. The records don't call them CEOs, but you can practically see them running medieval startups with no weekends off. And privacy? Forget it. Walls are thin, doors often missing, and entire families share beds for warmth. You picture a woman lying awake at night, listening to her husband's snores, her child's restless kicks, and her neighbor's gossip bleeding through the wooden slats. It makes you appreciate modern walls more than you thought possible. Still, there are tiny moments of beauty. A mother braiding her daughter's hair by candlelight, fingers moving like a weaver's loom. A song hummed softly while scrubbing floors, transforming drudgery into something almost tender. A gesture of kindness, an extra scrap of bread slipped to a hungry child. Or a whispered story told in the dark, passing culture in secret threads. By the time you step back into the courtyard, you realize the medieval household wasn't just a building. It was a crucible where women's lives were burned, shaped, and reshaped daily. Every meal cooked, every thread spun, every lullaby hummed was both ordinary and monumental. And though the records reduce them to housewives, you've just seen the truth. They were engineers of survival, unsung poets of endurance, and silent guardians of everyone else's comfort. The courtyard gives way to shadows, and soon you find yourself standing in the long, echoing nave of a medieval church. Candles flicker against stone walls, their light pooling on mosaics of saints and angels. And everywhere you turn, you feel the weight of faith pressing down. For men, the church might be a place of guidance or authority. For women, it was more complicated, part refuge, part prison, part stage for expectations they never asked for. You notice them first on their knees, heads bowed under veils, fingers fumbling along rosary beads. Their prayers are not lofty philosophical debates. They are practical pleas whispered with urgency: healthy births, protection from fever, enough rain but not too much. You imagine the silent humor of it all, praying for weather like you're placing an order at a restaurant where the chef rarely listens. Beyond the pews, the church set rules for women's entire lives. Marriage laws, obedience codes, even what color cloth they could wear, everything was wrapped in doctrine. A widow might be shamed for being too independent. A young girl warned that her laughter could tempt the devil. A wife told her silence was holiness. You almost want to lean in and whisper, "Relax, she just giggled, not summoned Beelzebub." Yet here, too, is power in disguise. Women entered convents and became nuns, trading marriage for cloister walls. Inside those stone enclosures, they managed estates, brewed medicine, copied manuscripts, even taught children. Some became abbesses wielding authority equal to lords, their signatures binding contracts and their voices directing communities. Historians still debate how radical this independence really was. Were convents liberation or just another gilded cage? Perhaps both. And superstition clung to women with an iron grip. Midwives who delivered babies were praised one day, accused of witchcraft the next. A woman with knowledge of herbs might heal a fever, but if she healed too many, whispers would follow her home. Imagine trying to explain to a medieval priest that peppermint tea helps stomach cramps without being branded as suspiciously magical. Then there was Mary, the Virgin, exalted as the purest of women, held up as the impossible standard. Every sermon, every mural, every hymn seemed to remind women, be like her. Obedient, modest, silent, undefiled. Yet in the same breath, Eve was dragged out as a warning, curious, disobedient, the one who doomed everyone. Talk about mixed messages. Either saint or sinner. Never just human. Still, faith carried comfort too. A mother lighting a candle for a sick child. A widow clutching a relic, whispering to a saint whose story mirrored her own grief. A girl joining a procession, her bare feet aching but her voice rising in song. In these quiet rituals, belief became survival, a thread stitching fragile hope into a fragile life. When you finally step back through the heavy wooden doors, the church spire looms above you. Both beautiful and daunting, women here bore the weight of impossible standards, suspicion, and restrictions, but also carved out quiet spaces of resilience. The echo of their footsteps lingers, softer than bells but steadier than sermons. And you realize, in the Middle Ages, faith was never neutral for women. It was both chain and shield, curse and comfort, woven into every breath they took. You step into a narrow alley of a medieval town, and the air feels different, thicker with the scents of yeast and sour ale, of smoke curling from chimneys, of lives pressed so close together you can almost hear their secrets clinking like coins in a purse. This is the world of peasant women, the backbone of medieval society. Though no chronicle bothered to carve their names into parchment, you see them bent over buckets, scrubbing clothes in icy water until their fingers turn raw. Others crouch near hearths, stirring stews that stretch scraps into meals, if you've ever watered down soup to make it last. Imagine doing that daily for a family of 7. And then there's the endless rhythm of grinding grain, spinning wool, fetching water. One historian joked that if medieval women had Fitbits, the devices would have exploded before noon. Marriage came early, sometimes at 12 or 13. You catch a girl carrying bread, and she looks more like a child playing at house than a wife in waiting. By 20, many women already had multiple children, their bodies bearing the weight of constant pregnancies. And childbirth? Let's just say it was less natural miracle, and more roll the dice with your life. Midwives prayed as much as they worked, because survival rates for mother and infant were terrifying. Still, women's work shaped everything. They brewed beer, the household staple before clean water was common. They ran market stalls, haggling with sharper tongues than any tax collector. They patched roofs with reeds, tended gardens, milked goats, and sometimes even joined harvest crews in fields, swinging sickles under the same hot sun as men. Yet when it came time to record accomplishments, credit usually skipped past them, landing safely in the laps of their husbands or lords. And then there were the strange little rules. Women couldn't always buy or sell without male permission. A wife's property became her husband's once vows were spoken. Even the clothes mattered. Sumptuary laws dictated that women of lower rank couldn't wear silk or certain colors. Imagine a medieval fashion police ticketing you for daring to wear teal because that's too noble for your station. But here's the odd twist. Peasant women often had more visible work and influence than noble women, who were locked in castles. A market woman knew the gossip of half the town. A brewer could become indispensable. A widow might run her late husband's workshop without apology. These small cracks in the system sometimes allowed unexpected independence. Historians still debate how much agency these women really had. Were they quietly powerful in their communities? Or were they crushed beneath endless labor and patriarchy? The truth, as always, likely threads the needle between. They suffered, yes, but they also adapted, joked, traded, and carved dignity out of the grindstone. As you pass a group of women laughing together at a well, you realize even in backbreaking lives, humor was survival. They mocked stingy husbands, cursed leaky roofs, shared remedies, and probably invented the medieval version of mom memes long before Facebook groups. The suffering was real, but so was the spark. Glinting like sunlight in the bucket of water one woman swings up toward her shoulder. You move away from the chatter of the market well, and suddenly the walls close in tighter, stone giving way to iron. and the air thickens with the silence of expectations. You've stepped into the shadow of the castle, where noble women lived lives that seemed gilded but were, in truth, cages lined with silk. Here, a girl of 12 might be dressed in saffron velvet and paraded before visiting lords as though she were a fine horse at auction. Marriages weren't so much about love as about land, power, and alliances. You picture her standing stiff in the hall, trying not to fidget, while men twice her age debate her future as though she were a particularly tricky chess piece. And no, there were no swipe left options. Your family decided, and that was that. Once married, noble women became managers of estates while their husbands fought in wars or gallivanted on crusades. They oversaw harvest accounts, directed servants, and ensured the castle pantry didn't run dry. Imagine balancing the medieval version of Excel sheets with quills and abacuses. All while pregnant and expected to embody saintly patience. Some chroniclers even admit that women ran estates better than their husbands ever did, but of course, that detail gets a polite cough and shuffle in the record books. Yet even in castles, danger lurked, childbirth remained treacherous, disease cared little for titles. And if a husband died, a widow could suddenly wield great power. But always under scrutiny. Some remarried for protection, others fought tooth and nail to keep control of their estates. One widow in France was so determined that she supposedly slept with a dagger under her pillow, just in case her in-laws tried to reassign her lands by force. Education for noblewomen varied. Some were literate, reading psalters or romances, and a few even wrote poetry that survives today. Others were deliberately kept unlettered, lest too much knowledge make them unwomanly. You can almost hear the sighs of bright young women forced to stitch tapestries when they longed to argue theology or politics. Still, it wasn't all embroidery and sighs. Noble women sometimes rode to hunt, practiced falconry, or defended castles during sieges. Chroniclers describe women pouring boiling oil from battlements or negotiating truces. These glimpses crack the polished surface of passive damsels and show something sharper beneath: strategy, resilience, grit. Historians still debate whether noblewomen were oppressed victims of their gilded cages or subtle power brokers maneuvering within restrictions. Likely both. For every woman buried under duty, another bent the rules, carving influence in whispers and signatures. And you, standing in the drafty great hall, hear the rustle of gowns, the clink of goblets, the distant cry of hounds. You feel the weight of silks heavy on shoulders. Beautiful but suffocating. If peasant women labored under mud and sweat, noble women labored under gold and duty. Both kinds of suffering cut deep, just with different blades. You slip from the stone corridors of the castle into the echoing silence of cloisters, where the air smells of beeswax, ink, and cold stone. Here, the women who turned their backs on marriage and motherhood stepped into convent life. A world that promised safety but delivered its own peculiar brand of suffering. Picture rows of nuns in indigo habits, their hands rough from tending gardens, brewing medicines, or copying manuscripts. From the outside, convents looked like havens, no childbirth risks. No husbands dictating every move. No muddy fields to break your back in. But freedom wasn't exactly on the daily schedule. The rule of Saint Benedict didn't encourage much in the way of TikTok dances, unless you count chanting psalms in the middle of the night as choreography. Life inside was rigid, hours split by bells, meals eaten in silence, punishments for even small mistakes. You can imagine forgetting to bow at the right moment and spending a week on bread and water. Your stomach grumbling louder than the church organ. One chronicler recorded that some convents locked rebellious nuns in dark rooms for days. Though whether this was discipline or gossip is still debated by historians. And yet, convents offered rare opportunities. Some women became scholars, writing treatises on medicine, theology, or visions of heaven. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, composed music that still drifts into concert halls today, proving that even within stone walls, creativity could flourish. But for every Hildegard, there were dozens of nameless nuns quietly stitching altar cloths or copying psalters until their eyes burned. Not all entered willingly. Families sometimes shoved daughters into convents like chess pieces off the board. Too many sisters to marry off. Or dowries too expensive. Imagine being 13, handed a veil, and told this was your calling. You'd probably raise an eyebrow. If only eyebrows were allowed. Some nuns rebelled by sneaking letters to lovers or smuggling sweets under their robes. A few even escaped, though most were dragged back. Their punishment harsher than before. Mysticism colored convent life too. Women claimed visions of Christ, saints, or apocalyptic fire. Some were celebrated, others accused of hysteria. A nun who heard voices might be hailed as divinely inspired, or quietly tucked away as embarrassing. Historians still debate how much was genuine faith and how much was desperation for recognition in a world that silenced women's voices. And hovering always was the shadow of plague, famine, or war. Convents weren't immune to raids, shortages, or disease. Imagine chanting your psalms as soldiers stormed the walls. Or watching half your sisters vanish from fever. The echo of their chants replaced by silence. So, while cloisters spared women some hardships, they replaced them with others: monotony, rigid control, isolation. You feel it now, standing in a cold stone cell, bare, quiet, with only a wooden cross on the wall. Outside, peasants bent under plows and noblewomen under silk. But here, under candlelight, women bore the weight of endless prayer and silence. The cloister doors close behind you, and the hum of chants fades into the rustle of linen skirts and the creak of cradles. Because outside convent walls, most women's lives were written in childbirth, and often, tragically, ended there. You don't need a medical degree to guess that medieval obstetrics was less modern delivery suite, and more, grit your teeth and pray while the midwife fumbles in the candlelight. Picture a dim cottage room, rushes on the floor, a fire sputtering low, and a circle of women surrounding the laboring mother. Fathers were usually banished, pacing outside like nervous medieval Uber drivers waiting for a package that might never arrive. Midwives, some skilled, others barely trained, rubbed oils, murmured prayers, and tightened charms around wrists to ward off evil spirits. Because if you thought labor was dangerous, try doing it while everyone insists demons are waiting to snatch your baby if you don't hang the right amulet above the bed. The risks were staggering: infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labor. Words that today send people to the were often death sentences then. No anesthetic, no C-sections at least. Not ones where the mother lived. No antibiotics. For many women, surviving childbirth once was luck. Surviving it half a dozen times? Basically a medieval lottery win. And it wasn't just mothers. Infants faced odds so grim they'd make a Vegas bookie sweat. Half of all children didn't make it to adulthood. Families baptized newborns immediately, not just for faith but in case the little one didn't last the week. That tiny copper basin wasn't just a religious symbol, it was a grim insurance policy. Midwives themselves walked a tightrope. Celebrated when things went well. Accused of witchcraft when they didn't. If a baby died, villagers might whisper that the midwife cursed the family. Some were dragged into trials. Their herbal remedies twisted into sorcery. Imagine risking your life to deliver babies and then getting accused of consorting with the devil because labor didn't go smoothly. Hardly the 5-star Yelp review they deserved. And yet, amidst all this danger, there was tenderness too. Women sang lullabies, stitched tiny swaddling cloths, passed down herbs thought to ease colic. Birth was terrifying, but it was also the heartbeat of community. Every baby meant hope, even if fragile. Historians still debate how much women themselves controlled these spaces. Whether midwives carved out female-only domains of power or whether male doctors increasingly intruded as experts. What's certain is that childbirth shaped medieval womanhood more than almost anything else. Its shadow stretching over every marriage bed. You step away from the cottage. The sound of a baby's cry following you, thin, uncertain, but alive. For tonight at least, one more mother survived, one more child took breath. And in the harsh arithmetic of the Middle Ages, that counted as a victory. You leave the cottage behind, but the echo of that frail cry lingers as you step into the open yard where women bend over steaming cauldrons and tubs. Because after childbirth came another daily trial, keeping children alive, clothed, and fed, while juggling endless chores that would make your modern, to-do list look like a vacation itinerary. Picture a woman in a russet gown, sleeves rolled, scrubbing linen in icy water while her toddler tugs at her skirt and her older daughter minds the goats. Laundry wasn't a quick spin cycle, it was hauling buckets from the well. Boiling water over smoky fires. And beating clothes against wooden boards until your arms ached. Medieval women didn't count steps with a fitness tracker. They clocked them hauling water, grain, and wood, day after day, until their joints groaned. Meals weren't any easier. Bread had to be baked, ale brewed, and pottage stirred endlessly. And if you think meal prepping is tedious, try grinding grain on a hand quern every morning before dawn, just so your family wouldn't starve. Flour dust in your hair, smoke in your eyes, and a baby on your hip. You'd basically be living in a non-stop reality show called Survivor, Medieval Edition. Children, if they made it past infancy, needed constant tending, swaddled tightly for months. They were carried everywhere while mothers worked, strapped into crude cradles or swung in hammocks near the hearth. Toys? If you were lucky, a carved stick or rag doll. Otherwise, you played with chickens, cheap entertainment. Though the chickens probably didn't appreciate it. And when sickness struck, women bore the brunt of it. Herbal remedies, poultices of onion or garlic, whispered prayers to saints, they tried anything. Some remedies worked, Others, well, let's just say, rubbing a dead mole on the skin, probably didn't cure much. But when a child coughed or a husband burned with fever, it was women who stayed up through the night, whispering lullabies, changing damp cloths, and praying for dawn. These endless labors were often invisible to chroniclers, who preferred to write about kings and knights. Yet without women's daily grind, medieval life would have collapsed in a week. Historians still debate how much power women held in these domestic spaces. But they agree that the home was the engine of survival, and women were the ones keeping it running. You glance back at the woman by the cauldron, her face streaked with sweat and ash, her hands raw from scrubbing. She hums softly as she works, the tune almost drowned by the crackle of fire. It's not glamour, it's not glory, but it's the quiet strength that carried families through the dark weight of the Middle Ages. From the smoky yard you wander toward the marketplace, and suddenly the air fills with chatter, clinking coins, and the smell of fish that's definitely been sitting out too long. Here, women step into a different role, not just tending hearths, but keeping stalls, selling produce, brewing ale, spinning cloth. If the home was survival, the market was negotiation, and women knew how to haggle better than any merchant banker in Florence. Picture a woman with teal sleeves rolled high, her basket brimming with onions, shouting prices above the din while her toddler naps on a blanket at her feet. Another leans over a stall of dyed wool, testing the fibers between calloused fingers, bargaining fiercely. They weren't just helpers in many towns. Women ran entire market days. Alewives brewed and sold beer so often that local councils passed laws just to keep them in line. Imagine Starbucks run entirely by tired moms with cauldrons. You'd never get away without paying for extra foam. Of course, competition was rough. Male guilds often tried to push women out, claiming brewing or weaving belonged to them. Fines, restrictions, and endless rules piled up. Yet women kept finding ways to slip around them. Sell from your door instead of a stall. Make trades in kind rather than coin, improvise or vanish. Historians still argue how much autonomy these small trades gave women. But the surviving court records are full of their names. Proof that they were out there hustling. Markets weren't just about goods, they were social theaters. News spread, gossip bloomed, alliances formed. One day you might hear who was caught watering down ale. The next about a neighbor accused of stealing a goose. And yes, sometimes it got ugly, fights broke out. Debts went unpaid, stalls were overturned, but women learned to navigate it, balancing assertiveness with caution, building reputations that kept families afloat. And the risks? Theft, harassment, even accusations of cheating could ruin you. Some women ended up in court for selling short measures or overcharging. Others faced harsher judgment simply for being too successful, because nothing raised eyebrows faster in the Middle Ages than a woman who earned more than her husband. You can almost hear the mutters, "She must be up to something." Yet for many, this was empowerment in a world stacked against them. The clatter of scales, the jingle of coins, the nod of a satisfied customer. These were victories. However small, walking through the market, you realize women weren't just silent sufferers, they were also negotiators, entrepreneurs, and survivors, carving space for themselves between the bread stalls and ale barrels. And as the bells toll for noon, The bustle briefly pauses, buyers clutching loaves, sellers counting pennies, children tugging skirts. In that heartbeat of stillness, you glimpse the resilience of women who refused to vanish, even when the system wished they would. The marketplace fades behind you, but the smell of yeast and wood smoke lingers as you drift toward the warm glow of a tavern. Inside, benches creak, mugs clink, and laughter hums like a low drumbeat. Taverns were the living rooms of the Middle Ages, and women often stood behind the counter, brewing, serving, managing the chaos with more authority than many lords ever dreamed of. Picture a stout woman in russet linen, hair tied back, one hand balancing a tray of ale jugs, the other scolding two drunken apprentices about to wrestle in the corner. Honestly, she's less bartender, more referee. Alewives, as they were called, brewed the drink that kept villages running. Remember, water wasn't always safe to drink, so ale was the daily hydration. Without women, half the population would have been perpetually thirsty, or very sober. Which frankly sounds worse, but success came with suspicion. Churchmen wagged their fingers about women who brewed too much or dared to make a profit, accusing them of greed or witchcraft. Imagine your side hustle on Etsy ending with a trial because your neighbor swore your sourdough starter had demonic tendencies. Some alewives gained real status, their taverns becoming local hubs where gossip traveled faster than a pigeon. But others faced ruin when prices rose or laws tightened. Councils set standards for ale quality, sometimes making examples of women by parading them through town for selling weak brew. You can almost hear the mutters, "Watered down again. Agnes, to the pillory with you." A bad Yelp review today might sting, but in medieval England it could involve actual rotten vegetables thrown at your head. And yet, taverns offered a rare space for women to exercise authority in public. They managed accounts, controlled stock, and kept order, sometimes with nothing more than a glare that could silence a brawling blacksmith. Historians still debate whether these roles were truly empowering or just tolerated until men took over brewing on an industrial scale. But for a few centuries, women's hands literally kept the beer flowing and the towns buzzing. As you step back out into the evening air, you realize taverns weren't just about ale. They were about women carving out authority in places where their voices usually didn't matter, turning hops and barley into both survival and a small measure of independence. And the laughter spilling out into the night feels less like drunken noise and more like defiance, bubbling up from mugs that women themselves had brewed. The laughter from the tavern fades as you walk into the narrow lanes of a town at night, where shadows stretch long and lanterns sputter against the dark. Behind closed shutters, whispers curl like smoke, whispers of women accused of witchcraft. Fear prowls these streets more quietly than plague. But just as deadly, you hear a door slam, a dog bark, and a cry that cuts off too quickly. It's unsettling, the way suspicion hunts like a stray cat in the dark, choosing its prey with no reason other than rumor. In the Middle Ages, accusations of witchcraft were not yet the bonfire frenzy you might picture from later centuries. But seeds were already sprouting. Women who brewed strange herbs, midwives who knew too much about birth, widows who muttered curses under their breath, all could become targets. A cow dies? Blame the neighbor's wife. A storm ruins crops? Clearly someone danced with the devil last Tuesday. If social media cancel culture had a medieval prototype, this was it, except instead of losing followers, you risked losing your life. One strange fact is how often witch tests involved things like bread and cheese. In some villages, accused women had to eat a piece of consecrated bread without choking to prove their innocence. Imagine your life hanging on whether a crumb goes down the wrong pipe. Historians still debate whether these trials were more symbolic theater than serious belief. But for the women trapped in them, it hardly mattered. Fear and shame could ruin reputations long before any rope was tied. You picture a small chapel at dawn, where a woman stands accused, hands trembling, eyes darting to the faces of neighbors she once laughed with at market. Some look away, others stare hard, as though her fate is already sealed. A priest drones prayers, a clerk scribbles notes, and outside, children whisper tales about black cats and cauldrons. The cruelty isn't always in the punishment, it's in the silence of those who once shared bread with her, now watching as though she has grown horns overnight. And yet, some women leaned into the whispers, cultivating reputations as wise women, cunning folk, or healers who straddled the line between holy and forbidden. They dispensed charms, love potions, and remedies, earning coin while carefully dodging the church's disapproval. You can almost hear one mutter, "They call it witchcraft. I call it good business." As you leave the alley behind, the night feels heavier. The whispers follow, curling around your ears like smoke you can't shake. Witchcraft accusations weren't just superstition, they were mirrors of fear, power, and control, showing how quickly a woman's life could unravel in the threadbare hands of rumor. And you realize, in the medieval dark, danger didn't always come from disease or swords. Sometimes it came from your neighbor's tongue. You step from the hush of superstition into a different kind of burden, the endless weight of childbirth in the Middle Ages. The air grows thick with the smell of straw, sweat, and candle smoke as you imagine yourself in a cramped chamber where women gather around a laboring mother. There are no doctors here, only midwives and neighbors, whispering prayers and clutching talismans. The cry of labor is sharp, raw, and unrelenting. You wince just listening, and honestly, you're pretty sure you wouldn't survive one medieval delivery. No epidurals, no clean sheets, just grit, groans, and the occasional blessing scrawled on parchment. It was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do: give birth. Records suggest maternal mortality was staggeringly high, with infections, hemorrhage, and obstructed labor stealing lives in hours. Babies, too, often never drew a breath. Historians still debate the exact percentages. But the grim truth is clear: medieval family trees had many short, broken branches, and yet, childbirth was so frequent that for many women, it was simply woven into daily existence. You worked, you cooked, you spun wool, and every few years, you risked your life again. Some facts are stranger than fiction. In certain regions, priests would place relics on a woman's belly to speed delivery. Or she might be handed a belt supposedly worn by the Virgin Mary herself, though more likely, it was just a piece of cloth passed from church to church with a good story attached. Others believed a woman should grip an iron key or a piece of blessed bread to ensure the baby came safely. Imagine juggling labor pains while someone insists you clutch your house keys for luck. And midwives, often dismissed by learned men, were the true guardians here. They knew herbs that eased pain, rituals that calmed panic, and sometimes little tricks to coax a stubborn child into the world. Yet, the very knowledge that made them indispensable also made them vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft if something went wrong. If mother or child died, whispers quickly turned to blame. She meddled with dark forces. You picture one midwife now. Sleeves rolled, face lined with years of worry and wisdom. She leans over the mother, wiping her brow with a linen cloth, murmuring reassurance. In the corner, a father paces, powerless, muttering prayers. Outside, neighbors wait to hear a cry, either one of new life or one of mourning. The whole village breathes with that one woman's body. And you realize, childbirth was never just a private moment. It was a communal gamble. One more arena where medieval women bore the weight of life and death while the world expected them to endure it quietly. Each birth was both miracle and risk. And every surviving child was a reminder of the countless women who had paid with their lives. The echoes of the birthing chamber give way to another place of confinement, the convent. You step into a cloister where stone walls ring with chants, and women in coarse habits move silently through corridors lit by narrow shafts of light. At first glance, you might think this was a refuge, a sanctuary from the dangers of childbirth and the demands of marriage. And in some ways, it was, but for many medieval women, the convent was less a calling and more a cage. Families often placed daughters here not out of piety but practicality. A dowry for a nun was cheaper than a dowry for a wife. And a girl sent to a convent meant one less mouth to feed, one less claim on inheritance. You imagine a teenage girl staring through the iron grate of the convent gate. Not because she chose it, but because her family did. It's like being told you've won a one-way ticket to spiritual boarding school with no chance of graduation. Life inside had its own hardships. Women woke before dawn, shivered through prayers in unheated chapels, and spent hours copying manuscripts or tending gardens. Meals were plain, often meager: bread, pottage, a little cheese if the abbess was feeling generous. And yet, compared to the grinding labor of peasant fields or the dangers of marriage, some women found a strange kind of agency here. Nuns could learn to read, even write, when most women outside the walls remained illiterate. Some rose to power as abbesses, controlling land, money, and entire communities. But freedom had limits. Contact with the outside world was heavily restricted, and strict rules governed even the smallest actions. Laughter could be punished. Songs outside of liturgy frowned upon. If you wanted to sneak in a snack at midnight, well, forget it, sister. And the whispers of scandal never stopped. Chronicles tell of nuns accused of breaking vows, of convents falling into disrepute, of outsiders suspicious of women living outside male control. Historians still debate whether these stories reflect reality or just the anxieties of a male-dominated society. You picture one young novice now, her face pale in candlelight as she copies a sacred text, brown ink smudging her fingers. Her eyes flick up toward a high, narrow window, where a sliver of moonlight sneaks in. She doesn't cry, doesn't sigh, but her stillness tells you she's imagining another life, one beyond these cloistered walls. And so the convent becomes a paradox. It is both prison and possibility, a place where women suffered isolation but also sometimes found learning, influence, and unexpected resilience. You can almost hear the rustle of habits and the low hum of psalms, both soothing and suffocating, wrapping medieval women in silence they did not always choose. From the silence of cloisters, your steps carry you into the bustle of a medieval marketplace. where women are no longer cloaked in habits but cloaked in noise. Bargaining and survival. The market smells of fish left too long on the stall, of onions, wool, and sweat. Women stand behind wooden tables stacked with bread, jugs of ale, baskets of apples, or bundles of spun yarn. Their voices rise above the crowd, not timid, not meek, but sharp as the knives they used to slice loaves or cut cloth. Markets were one of the rare public stages where women had visible presence. Widows often took up their late husband's trades, selling leather goods, weaving cloth, or running taverns. Single women hawked produce grown in their garden plots. Even married women joined their husbands behind counters, hands moving as quickly over coins as over kneading dough. For all the sermons about women's place being at home, the reality was that homes spilled into streets, and women's labor was woven into every corner of daily life. But the freedom came with strings. Guilds, those powerful male-dominated associations, rarely admitted women, and when they did, it was often only as widows holding the shop in trust, until a son could inherit. Records show cases of women fined for daring to sell without permission. As if the act of survival itself needed male approval. You can almost imagine a woman muttering under her breath as she pays the fine, "Sure, I'll hand over my pennies. But you try selling cabbages without me and see how far you get." Still, some women carved out space. Ale brewing, for instance, was dominated by women in many towns, giving rise to the alewives, who sold foamy mugs from their doorsteps. They became so common that their image, tall hats, cauldrons, cats prowling, later fed into the stereotype of witches. Imagine that. A woman who just wanted to make a living pouring beer ends up demonized for it centuries later. Historians still debate whether this link between alewives and witch imagery was deliberate smear or cultural accident. But either way, it shows how thin the line was between ordinary work and dangerous suspicion. In the marketplace, survival was a performance. A woman needed to haggle fiercely, smile sweetly, and keep one eye on her goods and another on the town bailiff. One false move, and she could be accused of cheating weights, of selling spoiled goods, of disturbing the peace. Yet in the clamor, there was life. Children tugged at skirts, chasing each other between stalls. Bells from the church tower mingled with the shouts of vendors. For a few hours each day, the marketplace gave women visibility, voice, and a chance, however fragile, to shape their own fortunes. You stand there among them, hearing the laughter, the gossip, the sharp retorts, and you realize, medieval women were not silent figures hidden in shadows. They were bartering, brewing, baking, bustling, making the medieval world turn, even if history too often pretended otherwise. The market chatter fades as you wander into the quieter, dimly lit halls of medieval hospitals, though hospital here doesn't mean what you think. These weren't sterile, white-tiled spaces with beeping machines. They were part church, part almshouse, part infirmary, where women's suffering and women's labor collided. You step through wooden doors and are greeted by the scent of herbs, incense, and something less pleasant, rot masked poorly by rosemary sprigs. Inside, women often served as caretakers, nurses, or herbal healers. Nuns ran many of these institutions, tending to the sick as acts of charity. Their work was backbreaking, washing sores, spooning broth into trembling mouths, sitting vigil through endless nights. They had no gloves, no antiseptic, only cloth rags and prayer. And yet, patients often preferred the touch of these women to that of university-trained male physicians, who arrived with big theories but little willingness to scrub linens. But not all women here tended others, they also lay in the beds. Childbirth complications filled wards, fever, plague, infected wounds. These struck women as ruthlessly as men, but with one extra sting. Their pain was often brushed aside as natural weakness. If a woman lingered too long in sickness, whispers began. Maybe she sinned. Maybe God punished her. Imagine coughing yourself hoarse and still being told your morals, not your lungs, were the problem. Some women, however, fought for knowledge. Midwives kept notebooks of herbs and remedies, passed quietly from hand to hand. One might boil willow bark for pain, mix honey into ointments, or brew teas of sage and fennel. These practices worked often enough to outshine the scholars quoting Aristotle in Latin. But midwives walked a dangerous line, too skilled, and they risked accusations of sorcery. One wrong outcome in childbirth, and angry families might mutter that she was in league with the devil. Historians still debate how widespread such accusations really were. But the fear was real, humming beneath every successful delivery. In the flicker of candlelight, you picture a young nun pressing a wet cloth to a patient's forehead, her face pale with exhaustion yet steady with faith. Across the ward, a midwife adjusts a bundle of herbs hanging from the rafters, muttering a blessing under her breath. Between them lies a girl no older than 15, writhing from childbirth, clutching a wooden cross with desperate fingers. You stand at the edge of the hall, hearing the coughs, the murmurs, the whispered prayers, and you realize these hospitals weren't just places of healing, they were theaters of endurance, where women bore the suffering of others while carrying their own. The work was relentless, the gratitude uncertain, and the risk of blame always near. Yet without these women, entire communities would have been left to rot in silence. The smoky air of the hospital gives way to the chill of stone corridors where convent bells echo softly. Here, cloistered away from the noise of markets and battles, women lived lives both protected and confined. Nuns in the Middle Ages had their own form of suffering, different from peasant toil, yet heavy in its own right. You picture a novice entering the convent at 13, her family handing her over as if trading one burden for another. Maybe she was the extra daughter, with no dowry to marry. Or maybe her parents thought cloistered walls would keep her safe. Either way, her voice in the matter rarely mattered. Behind heavy oak doors, she swapped silk ribbons for plain veils, laughter for silence, and freedom for obedience. The rules were relentless: silence during meals, fasting until your stomach roared like a medieval tavern cat, hours upon hours of prayer. You kneel until your knees feel like fire. And when you try to shift, the abbess' eyes catch you like a hawk. And don't even think about sneaking extra food. Bread locked in cupboards was counted like treasure. But convents weren't just prisons, they were paradoxes. For some women, they offered education unavailable anywhere else. Nuns copied manuscripts, taught children, brewed medicines, and even advised kings through letters. A few abbesses wielded power like CEOs in habits. Yet for many, It was suffocating. You can almost hear a young woman scribbling her secret thoughts in the margins of a psalter. Longing for fields, laughter, or even just a moment where she didn't have to chant Latin she barely understood. Strange facts emerge from records. Did you know some convents brewed beer and sold it to keep afloat? Imagine holy sisters arguing about hops like craft brewers. Others trained choir girls who sang so beautifully that pilgrims wept. Yet alongside these glimmers, there were scandals. Rumors of nuns sneaking lovers in, or abbesses accused of corruption. Historians still debate whether such scandals were exaggerated smear campaigns or awkward truths about human needs trapped in stone walls. You walked past an imagined cloister garden, herbs swaying gently, a nun bending to gather lavender while another rings a bell for vespers. Their faces are serene, but you sense undercurrents, girls who never chose this path. Women who traded one cage for another. And you realize, convent life was painted as holy retreat. But for many women, it was another arena of suffering wrapped in piety. A life of service, yes, but also silence, longing, and the eternal weight of vows spoken too young to fully understand. You leave the cloister's echo and step into the grand halls of castles, where luxury sparkled, but only for some. For women behind those heavy walls, life wasn't endless feasts and gowns flowing with velvet. No, it was a gilded cage, filled with expectations, whispers, and the constant reminder that your worth was tied to alliances, heirs, and appearances. Imagine you're a noblewoman, dressed in saffron silk, your hair braided with ribbons heavy enough to pull your head backward. At a feast, you smile politely as musicians strum and goblets clink. But under the table, your stomach knots, because every bite, every glance, every conversation is part of a performance. One slip, one wrong laugh at the wrong joke, and you become the subject of castle gossip faster than you can say, medieval TikTok. Marriage wasn't romance, it was politics. You were betrothed at 12, married at 14, and expected to produce heirs before your dolls were even tucked away. And childbirth? That was your battleground. In some noble households, women bore a dozen children, only to bury half of them before they reached adulthood. The castle midwife was your closest ally and your greatest fear. And let's be honest, medieval anesthesia was about as effective as chewing on a stick and hoping for the best. Behind the banners and torches, you carried burdens invisible to the armored men at war. Your body was currency. Your smile diplomacy, your very survival dependent on whether you gave birth to boys or girls. Historians still debate just how much power noblewomen wielded. Some point to queens who ruled regencies with iron hands, while others argue that even a queen was never free from the expectations of motherhood and marriage. Here's a little-known fact. Many noblewomen secretly managed finances, estates, and letters while their husbands rode off to war. Picture a lady of the manor counting coins by candlelight, sealing contracts with her signet, all while being told her true purpose was embroidery and prayer. You stroll mentally through a castle corridor. Tapestries hang heavy. Servants scurry. And at the center sits a young woman on a carved chair. Her face composed but her eyes distant. You can almost hear her sigh, caught between privilege and prison. And you realize, for medieval noblewomen, life in the castle wasn't a fairy tale. It was a high-stakes game played with their bodies, their children, and their silence. Behind the glamour shimmered a loneliness as sharp as the draft blowing through stone halls. You leave the castle's drafty corridors and wander into the dim cells of convents, where women's lives followed an entirely different script, quiet, enclosed, and yet strangely powerful in ways the outside world often forgot. Imagine rows of nuns in indigo habits, their voices rising in chant as candlelight flickers against stone walls. At first glance, it feels serene, but lean closer, and you'll hear the tension, the push and pull between devotion, duty, and the same restrictions that echoed everywhere else in the Middle Ages. Many women entered convents not by choice but by circumstance. Maybe her dowry was too small to attract a husband. Maybe her family wanted to park her somewhere safe. Or maybe she just annoyed her brothers one too many times. Instead of silk gowns and feasts, she received a coarse wool habit, a prayer book, and a life measured by bells ringing through the day and night. You might joke it's the medieval equivalent of being forced into an eternal group project, with no escape clause. Life inside wasn't simple. Nuns woke at midnight for matins, trudged through freezing cloisters for prayers at dawn, copied manuscripts until their fingers cramped, and worked gardens or brewed medicines in silence. But don't mistake silence for passivity. Some convents became hubs of learning, their libraries richer than nearby monasteries. Women who might never have read beyond Psalms in a village church suddenly copied philosophy, theology, even science, though always framed as devotion. There were rebellions too. Records tell of nuns sneaking meat during fasts, refusing strict discipline, or even suing bishops in secular courts. Yes, women cloistered in stone walls sometimes wielded more legal agency than their married sisters outside. Historians still debate whether these acts were rare exceptions or everyday defiance. But the stories prove convent life wasn't just prayer and passivity. Here's a fact few mention. Some abbesses commanded entire estates, ruling lands, collecting rents, and managing vassals like miniature feudal lords. Picture an abbess in russet robes, seated with ledgers open, calmly telling a knight he owes the convent 3 pigs and 2 barrels of ale. Not exactly the image of meek submission, right? And yet, underneath that authority lingered the same limitations. Vows bound their bodies, their words, their futures. Even abbesses ultimately answered to bishops or popes, men who dismissed their accomplishments as secondary. It's as if women in convents lived in a paradox, enclosed, but also freer than many outside, powerful, yet constantly undermined. You picture the convent garden at dusk, herbs swaying, sisters in saffron and teal tending to remedies for the sick, their voices humming a hymn. A fragile peace radiates here, stitched together with labor and prayer, but always shadowed by the weight of a world that never truly let women be their own. And you realize, convent life was no escape from suffering, it was simply another form of it. Softened by prayer, sharpened by confinement, and marked by the faint but stubborn glow of resistance. You leave the cloister walls behind, stepping into the narrow lanes of a medieval market town, where the air buzzes with barter and gossip. At first, the bustle feels alive, apples stacked in baskets, bolts of cloth unfurled for buyers, tinkers clanging tools on display. But listen closer, And you hear the sigh beneath it all. Women bent beneath the weight of survival. Their suffering stitched into the very rhythm of trade. Most women here weren't free merchants with stalls to their names. They were the hidden hands, the wives of butchers, bakers, or blacksmiths, working long hours for little recognition. A butcher's wife might gut carcasses, sweep floors, tally accounts, and haggle with customers. Yet the sign above the shop bore only his name. If you've ever helped a coworker with their group project, only to see them take all the credit, congratulations. You've basically lived the medieval artisan's wife experience. Still, markets were one of the rare places where women's voices rang out. Widows especially carved space for themselves. Deprived of husbands, many took over stalls, sold goods, or managed shops. Some even became respected merchants, signing contracts with seals bearing their own initials. Historians still debate how widespread this independence was. But it's clear widowhood, grim as it was, opened doors marriage kept shut. There's a strange irony, though. Laws often restricted what women could sell. In some towns, women could hawk bread but not wine, cloth but not spices, raw goods but not the high-profit imports. The system was like handing someone a monopoly on turnips. Sure, it's freedom, but good luck getting rich on root vegetables. And then there's the humiliation baked right into daily life. A woman who sold watered-down ale, for instance, could be tied to the cucking stool and dunked in a river before laughing crowds. Imagine the medieval Yelp review, 1 star. Would not drink again, also public shaming included. Yet even in this grind, women found ways to bend the rules. Some ran small credit networks, lending coins to neighbors when husbands were away. Others bartered secretly, trading goods out of sight of guild officials. There's a record of a baker's wife who smuggled flour into her apron to bake extra loaves, claiming the Holy Spirit must have multiplied the grain. Not quite divine intervention, but clever enough to dodge punishment, at least for a while. Picture it. Twilight in the square. Women in saffron or russet gowns haggling fiercely over baskets of onions. Children tugging hems. Church bells ringing above the din. You feel the energy, life surging despite rules. Laughter slipping out between sighs. Beneath the weight of restriction, these women carved tiny victories, reminding you that even suffering can hum with resilience when survival demands it. You leave the market's clamor and step into a darker chamber, the walls of a medieval court, where women often found their fates decided by men with quills and seals. Justice, at least in theory, was supposed to be blind. In practice, she peeked under the blindfold and tended to wink at whoever had more coin or titles. For women, that usually meant walking in already guilty, unless fortune intervened. Picture a peasant woman accused of stealing bread. Maybe her children were hungry. Maybe she just couldn't pay the miller. She stands trembling before the bench, her russet dress threadbare, her hair covered in a kerchief. Men debate her fate like she's an afterthought. Punishments could be brutal, stocks, whippings, or worse, but often the shame cut deeper than the lash. Imagine being locked in a pillory while your neighbors pelted you with rotten turnips. It's basically medieval social media, public humiliation as entertainment. And then there were the infamous ordeals. Dunked in water to test purity. burned with hot irons to prove innocence, forced to carry glowing metal while prayers decided whether burns healed miraculously. If you floated in water, you were a witch. If you sank, well, at least you died proven innocent. It's like someone designed a justice system on lose-lose mode and never patched the bug. Noble women fared differently, but not always better. Their trials often became political theater. A duchess accused of treason might be judged less for evidence than for which faction at court wanted her land. The spectacle of scandal could ruin reputations even without execution. Some women were spared the gallows by exiled to a convent. Which sounds noble until you realize it meant spending the rest of your life copying psalms in a cold stone cell. Yet cracks in the system existed. Some women turned the very rules against their accusers. Records survive of women who cleverly manipulated dowry laws or inheritance claims, securing wealth when men expected obedience. A few even won their cases outright, wielding testimony like a weapon. Historians still debate whether these victories were rare exceptions or subtle signs of shifting norms. But their echoes linger in parchment margins and town rolls. You imagine leaving the courthouse as dusk falls. The heavy wooden doors groan shut, muffling voices of judges and clerks. Women scatter into the night, some clutching their dignity, others condemned, all marked by the ordeal. And you feel the bitter truth. Justice in the Middle Ages rarely bent toward fairness for women. Yet within its cracks, courage sometimes bloomed, a whisper of defiance, carried on parchment ink and weary footsteps, survives even here. The courthouse fades, and now your feet find the uneven stones of a city street at night. You can almost smell it, soot, horse dung, and a hint of ale from a nearby tavern. For women walking here, danger was not abstract. It pressed close, in shadows and doorways, in the laughter of drunk men spilling out of inns. Safety was a luxury few could afford. Picture a servant girl hurrying home with a basket of bread under her arm. She pulls her cloak tighter, the indigo wool worn thin at the elbows. Behind her, boots scrape on cobbles. She quickens her pace, heart pounding. In the Middle Ages, there were no street lights, no police patrols, only whatever courage you could summon. And if something happened, well, society rarely asked, "Are you okay?" More often, it asked, "What were you doing there?" Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Women's bodies became battlegrounds of vulnerability. Crimes were frequent, but courts demanded impossible standards of proof. Survivors were often shamed, silenced, or forced into marriages with their attackers. An official solution that feels more like a punishment. The whispers of "her fault" were just as sharp then as now, echoing across centuries, even within homes, supposed sanctuaries. Danger lingered, husbands wielded near total authority, and discipline was seen as a marital right. A slap, a shove, even harsher blows could be brushed off as household business, not crime. You might chuckle bitterly. Domestic bliss had a very different ring when your spouse could cite both law and scripture to justify bruises. But not all women accepted silence. Some resisted in small, ingenious ways, hiding money to escape, building networks of support, or appealing to saints in prayers that doubled as veiled cries for justice. Chronicles mention women banding together in markets, warning each other about dangerous men or corrupt officials. Safety wasn't given, it was carved out of solidarity. Historians still argue whether medieval towns were truly more dangerous for women than the countryside, or whether the fear was amplified by crowded streets and constant gossip. But the feeling of risk, of watching shadows, of clutching a key like a weapon, was undeniably real. And so, as you turn down this imagined alley, your breath misting in the cold, you sense the centuries collapse. The vulnerability of medieval women doesn't feel distant at all. It's there in the quickened heartbeat, the sideways glance, the whispered prayer under one's breath. Some things, sadly, never change as quickly as they should. The alley dissolves, and you step into a quieter, more suffocating space, the cloistered walls of a convent. At first glance, it seems serene, gardens neatly tended, chants drifting through stone corridors, sisters moving in saffron and russet habits. For some women, these cloisters were sanctuaries, places of study, refuge from marriage, or a calling to spiritual devotion. But for many others, the convent was less choice and more sentence. Imagine being the third daughter of a middling nobleman. Your dowry chest is small. Your family's coin already stretched thin after marrying off your sisters. Suddenly, the convent becomes your fate, not out of holiness, but out of financial convenience. You are sent with little say, sworn to vows that would shape the rest of your life. It's like being signed up for a lifetime subscription service without clicking agree. And the cancellation policy? Very strict. Life inside was rigid. The bells dictated every hour. Matins before dawn. Then lauds. Prime. Terce. Sext. Nun. Vespers. And finally compline before bed. Prayer interwove with work, copying manuscripts, tending herb gardens, brewing medicines, teaching girls, sometimes even managing estates. For a few, this brought education far beyond what most women could dream of. You'd learn Latin, scripture, even a little philosophy. But the flip side? The walls were also a cage, locking you into a world you never chose. Whispers of discontent slip through chronicles. Nuns who longed for life beyond cloisters, who wrote poetry filled with yearning, or who secretly rebelled with smuggled letters. Some convents became notorious for lax discipline. Historians still debate just how wild a few of those houses became. With rumors of feasts, lovers, even children born behind monastery walls. Others were the opposite, so strict that sisters were punished for speaking without leave or for smiling too often. Imagine being scolded for grinning at your friend across the dining hall. Even middle school detention sounds kinder. Still, convents weren't just prisons. They offered rare female autonomy. Abbesses could wield real authority, managing land, wealth, and communities of women with almost queenly power. Pilgrims visited their shrines, nobles sought their counsel, bishops grudgingly respected their independence. In a world that smothered women's voices, convent walls sometimes amplified them. And as you wander past the cloister garden, the roses carefully tended under teal dawn light, you can almost hear both sides of the story. The sigh of relief from one woman who escaped marriage by becoming a nun, and the sigh of despair from another who longed for children, laughter, or even just the freedom to walk outside without permission. The convent was both prison and palace, sanctuary and sentence. And like so much of women's medieval life, its reality was a paradox, safety bound with chains, knowledge hemmed in by walls, voices raised in song yet silenced outside the cloister. You slip out of the convent's cool shadow, only to stumble into a far less cloistered but equally suffocating reality: the marital home. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't about love songs under balconies. It was a business deal, sealed with handshakes, coins, and contracts. A daughter could be promised away as young as 12, her fate bundled up with land titles, livestock, or trade alliances. Imagine being traded like a particularly fancy goat. Except the goat might actually get better grazing rights. Inside those houses, women were expected to be obedient wives, fertile mothers, and efficient managers of the household. The husband ruled as lord under his roof, and disobedience was not just frowned upon but sometimes legally punishable. Records show that beating a wife was tolerated so long as the stick used wasn't thicker than a thumb. Yes, the infamous rule of thumb may have roots here, though historians still debate whether the phrase itself came later. Either way, the message was clear: his authority stretched even into her bones. Yet women held more responsibility than these power dynamics suggest. Wives brewed ale, spun wool, managed servants, kept accounts, and often ran shops or farms while husbands were away. If a husband died, widows sometimes stepped into his role entirely, proving they could handle business just as well. But society rarely applauded them. It simply waited to see if a man could take over again. There's an odd irony. The same system that tied women down relied on them to keep running. A man could play knight in shining armor, but his household would collapse if his wife stopped brewing, baking, or balancing the books. Historians still debate just how much autonomy wives carved out for themselves. Hidden between the lines of obedience, some letters and wills hint at partnerships that were warmer, even affectionate. Others read more like invoices. And here's a darker truth: if a marriage soured, escape was nearly impossible. Divorce in our modern sense didn't exist. Annulments could be granted, but only under rare conditions, like proving the marriage was never consummated. Otherwise, women were locked in for life. Even if their husbands vanished for years on crusade, the marriage bond was less, till death do us part, and more, till the paperwork says you're technically still married. You picture a young bride, saffron veil trailing, led into a dim cottage where her new life begins. She smiles dutifully, but you can see the weight in her eyes, part hope, part resignation, part calculation. Will he be kind? Will she survive childbirth? Will she ever see her family again? For her, love isn't written in sonnets. It's a gamble hidden in the shuffle of power, coin, and expectation. And as you step away, the sound of her whispered prayers lingers. They're not grand hymns, just small wishes: a safe night, a gentle hand, a child who lives. Wishes that, centuries later, still feel heartbreakingly human. The door closes on that weary bride, and when it opens again you find yourself in a place where pain is both public and private: the birthing chamber. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was not the sweet pastel-painted nursery scene we imagine today. It was closer to a battlefield. Only the weapons were linen sheets, boiling water, and whispered prayers. You'd probably prefer to face a dragon in chainmail than go through this. And honestly, who could blame you? Women entered labor surrounded not by doctors, but by other women, midwives, neighbors, and relatives who knew from experience what to do when the wailing began. Husbands were typically barred from the room. This was a female world. Thick with sweat, cries, and the smoky smell of herbs. Midwives rubbed bellies with oils, muttered charms against demons, and tied relics around wrists. Because who knew if Saint Margaret or a sprig of rosemary might help tip the scales between life and death. The danger was staggering. Maternal mortality rates soared. A woman might have 10 pregnancies and not survive half. Many infants joined her in tiny graves marked with nothing more than a wooden cross. Even if the baby lived, complications could leave the mother weakened for life. Think about it. For medieval women, motherhood wasn't just exhausting, it was lethal. And still, society expected them to keep producing heirs, as if their bodies were endlessly renewable. There are accounts of churching, the ritual cleansing a mother underwent after birth, where she was formally welcomed back into the community. On paper it sounds celebratory, in practice, it was also a way of marking her as unclean until the church said otherwise. Imagine staggering into a cold stone chapel weeks after delivery, still bleeding, still aching, and hearing prayers that cleanse you of something you never asked to carry in the first place. Midwives themselves lived precariously, revered when births went well. They could be accused of witchcraft if things went wrong. A stillborn child? Perhaps she angered God. A mother's death? Perhaps the midwife consorted with the devil. It was a job of compassion constantly shadowed by suspicion. Historians still debate whether these accusations reflected real fears or were just convenient excuses to blame women when nature was merciless. And amid all this suffering, tiny details of humanity flicker. Women embroidered swaddling cloths with protective charms. They sang lullabies before the child was even born. They braided each other's hair to distract from pain. Humor crept in too. Jokes about stubborn babies refusing to come out. Or about husbands who fainted if they dared peek inside. You can almost hear the nervous laughter bouncing against stone walls. Fragile and necessary. So you stand quietly in that room. The flicker of candles. The groan of a woman. The steady murmurs of midwives. It is raw. It is terrifying, and it is relentless. For medieval women, childbirth wasn't just a stage of life, it was a trial by fire. And every cradle that rocked afterward was also a reminder of how close death had lingered in the room. You step away from the birthing room, ears still ringing with cries, only to find yourself in another space where women's suffering was less visible but no less real, the monastery walls. On parchment, it might look serene, nuns gliding through cloisters, voices rising in song, but behind the hymns lay lives bound by rules as strict as any iron chain. Entering a convent was often less about calling and more about lack of options. A daughter without a dowry? A widow with no protector? A family trimming expenses by sending a girl to God? Into the cloister she went, vows of chastity and obedience locking her path as firmly as a castle gate. Daily life followed a rhythm that might make even your smartwatch groan. Prayers at midnight, dawn, midday, evening, and more in between. Hours of silence interspersed with chores, spinning wool, tending gardens, copying manuscripts by candlelight. Some women found peace here, a refuge from marriage and childbirth. Others withered, crushed by the absence of choice. Imagine being 16, still dreaming of festivals and dances, only to spend decades illuminating holy texts until your fingers cramped. Yet convents weren't only prisons, they were paradoxes. Within those walls, some women discovered rare authority. Abbesses wielded power over estates, managed wealth, and even advised bishops. Nuns educated girls, brewed medicines, and kept knowledge alive when plague and war tore through the outside world. A few mystics claimed visions so powerful they shook kingdoms. And still, whispers lingered. Was their devotion pure? Or tinged with hysteria? Were visions holy? Or just illness misunderstood? Historians still debate how much agency nuns truly held versus how much was tolerated until it threatened male authority. And let's not forget the darker edges. Convents could be places of exile, where unruly or embarrassing daughters were tucked away. Discipline was harsh. Disobedience might mean bread and water diets, cold cells, or the humiliation of public penance. You can almost hear the echo of sandals shuffling across stone, the faint creak of wooden doors shutting behind women who had no say in being there. Still, humanity thrived even here. Nuns exchanged letters laced with dry humor, sneaking in complaints about cold winters and poor rations. They painted saints with oddly familiar faces, perhaps little nods to friends or even secret crushes. They brewed beer so strong that travelers praised convent ales as much as their prayers. Imagine the irony. Forbidden from worldly pleasures, yet famous for producing the drink of merriment. So you linger in that cloister garden, where herbs grow in neat beds, and voices chant in the distance. For some, this life was salvation. For others, it was slow suffocation. Either way, the convent walls held countless untold stories of women navigating the narrow paths left open to them. Their suffering woven quietly into the fabric of holy routine. You leave the cloister's hush behind and step into the shadow of stone walls that loom heavier than any monastery, castles, where noble women lived lives gilded yet grueling. From a distance, you might envy the silk gowns, the jewels, the banquets lit by candlelight. But walk a little closer, and the glitter fades to chains. Marriage for noble women wasn't romance, it was strategy. Inked into treaties and sealed with rings. A girl of 12 might be sent across mountains to wed a man she'd never met, her body becoming a pawn on a chessboard of dynasties. And if you think swiping left on a bad match sounds rough, try explaining that to a teenager promised to a 50-year-old duke. Inside the castle, duties piled high. A lady was expected to oversee the household like a medieval CEO, managing servants, arranging feasts, organizing accounts, while also producing heirs on demand. Failure to give birth to sons could mean shame, annulment, or being quietly pushed aside. You can almost feel the tension of every pregnancy. Each one a gamble where the stakes were survival, legacy, and status. And yet, noble women also wielded a peculiar kind of power. Especially when husbands rode off to war or crusade. They managed estates, commanded defenses, even negotiated with rival lords. Chronicles note women who rallied soldiers from battlements or who cleverly brokered truces. Historians still debate how much authority these women truly held. Was it genuine leadership or simply filling a gap until a man returned? But in those gaps, Sparks of autonomy glimmered. Behind closed doors, not everything was politics and piety. Letters between noblewomen reveal gossip, wit, and even affection, proof that laughter thrived even in stone fortresses. Some women became patrons of poets or artists, slipping beauty into halls otherwise bristling with armor. Others turned to prayer, amassing collections of illuminated books that were both status symbols and private escapes. Imagine leafing through a manuscript adorned with saints, knowing your husband is planning another campaign abroad. But suffering clung to castle walls too. Isolation weighed heavy, especially for young brides transplanted far from their families. Infidelity was punished with brutal double standards. Men strayed with impunity, while women risked execution. You can almost hear the whispers behind tapestries. Rumors of scandal carried like daggers. Even the luxury of silk felt like a silken cage, draped over lives tightly bound by duty. So as you wander through a great hall, its tapestries glowing in the firelight, you sense both pride and pain stitched into the fabric. Noble women's suffering wasn't only hunger or disease, it was the burden of being symbols. Locked into roles as mothers, mediators, and ornaments of dynastic ambition, the castle may have glittered, but within it, countless women sighed under the weight of crowns they never asked to wear. You leave the echo of castle halls behind and step into a very different arena of womanhood, motherhood itself, where the suffering of women in the Middle Ages took its most relentless toll. You can almost hear the lullabies whispered in smoky cottages, or the prayers muttered in manor chambers, each one threaded with both love and fear. Childbirth wasn't just an event, it was a battlefield. And women were the soldiers drafted with no choice. Imagine this: no sterile tools, no epidurals, no comforting beeps of monitors. Just midwives with herbs and whispered charms. And the hope that today, the mother and child would both survive. The pain was overwhelming, and the risks were staggering. Historians estimate that a woman could expect to lose her life in childbirth more often than a man might lose his on a battlefield. It makes you think. Knights earned songs for bravery, but mothers faced their battles in silence, their courage unrecorded. There were traditions meant to protect them. Women might clutch relics, kiss charms, or keep a saint's candle burning as contractions ripped through them. Some midwives tied belts around women's bellies, blessed with prayers said to ease the agony. And yet, despite all this, mortality hung heavy in every birthing room. You picture a hushed chamber, the air thick with incense and fear, as neighbors wait outside, straining to hear a baby's cry. The suffering didn't end with birth. Survival meant endless cycles of nursing, pregnancy, and loss. It wasn't uncommon for a woman to bury multiple children before her own hair had turned gray. Some noble mothers were pressured to hand their newborns to wet nurses, their role reduced to producing heirs like a royal factory. Peasant mothers, meanwhile, worked in the fields with infants strapped to their backs, hoping the baby wouldn't starve before the harvest came in. And then there was the fear of dying alone. Branded as unclean, church rituals demanded purification before a woman could fully rejoin her community. As though surviving childbirth still left her marked. It added insult to injury, emerging from one of the hardest battles of her life, only to be told she needed cleansing. Yet there was tenderness too. Medieval lullabies survive in manuscripts. Gentle songs with simple rhymes. Mothers humming through exhaustion to soothe fragile lives. Archaeologists have even found cradles carved with protective charms. As if wood itself could shield a child from the world's cruelties. These traces remind you that amid suffering, love persisted, fragile, yes, but fierce enough to sing through centuries. So, as you stand beside a smoky hearth where a mother rocks her child with tired arms, you realize that her struggle was both ordinary and epic. She bore the weight of survival not just for herself but for the next generation. The suffering of medieval motherhood wasn't only pain and risk, it was also the burden of hope. Carried in every heartbeat of every child who managed to draw breath. You step away from the smoky hearth and into the world of expectation, because in the Middle Ages, a woman's worth wasn't measured only by her survival in childbirth but by the virtue she carried like a banner she could never set down. Chastity, obedience, silence, these weren't polite suggestions, they were shackles, woven into sermons, laws, and songs, and heaven forbid you slip, because the punishment was always harsher for you than for any man. Picture a village square where gossip hangs in the air thicker than chimney smoke. A woman seen speaking too freely with a neighbor's husband? Whispers begin. A girl walking home alone after dusk? Rumors spread. Reputation was fragile, and once tarnished, it clung like soot. Even noble women, draped in silk, could find their futures shattered by a single accusation. It didn't matter if it was true, appearances ruled. And women were always one glance away from disgrace. Virginity before marriage wasn't just prized, it was currency. Dowries depended on it, alliances hinged on it, and mothers watched their daughters like hawks to protect it. Yet men wandered freely. Their indiscretions, winked at or even celebrated. The double standard is enough to make you want to roll your medieval eyes, except, of course, if you rolled them too loudly. Someone might mutter that you were possessed. Punishments for stepping out of line ranged from shaming to exile. Sometimes even harsher. Women accused of adultery could be dragged through streets. Their heads shaved, their reputations permanently ruined. Meanwhile, a man caught in the same act might pay a fine, offer an apology, or simply shrug. The imbalance was baked into the very bones of the culture. And yet, some women found ways to flip the script. Clever wives used wit to turn accusations back on their husbands. Some towns held festivals where for one day, women mocked men publicly, an inversion of power that, while fleeting, gave a glimpse of the frustration simmering under centuries of silence. Chroniclers wrote about these customs with amusement, but you can almost hear the sharp edge in the laughter. Even in convents, where women fled to escape such scrutiny, chastity became armor and burden at once. Nuns were praised for their purity. Yet even they weren't free from suspicion if a monk or priest decided to point a finger. Control followed them like a shadow. Proof that there was nowhere women could walk without rules waiting. As you pause in this scene, you realize virtue wasn't simply personal, it was political. A woman's body could bind families, strengthen alliances, or shatter reputations. It wasn't hers to carry for herself, it was a tool wielded by fathers, husbands, and kings. And the cruelest irony? Women bore the suffering of chastity not because they failed, but because society never let them win. The air shifts as you step into the echo of silenced voices, because alongside the suffering, there was always resilience. Women in the Middle Ages endured, yes, but they also carved out spaces where their strength could not be erased. You feel it like an undercurrent, subtle but steady, as though every whispered prayer and every quiet rebellion was a thread stitched into history's fabric. Picture a marketplace, crowded and noisy, amid the clamor of merchants. A woman bargains fiercely, her voice carrying above the din. She knows how to measure cloth, how to weigh grain, how to calculate coins with a glance. She may not have the right to call herself a guild master. But make no mistake, her family survives because of her skill. Historians still debate how widespread women's economic influence was, but the evidence glimmers like gold threads in a tapestry. Account books signed by female hands. Letters of trade written in careful ink. In another corner of the world, a midwife ties her apron and steps into a cottage. She has no university degree, no patron saint carved above her name, but her knowledge of herbs and childbirth is what keeps entire villages alive. She carries authority in the hush of midnight, when a baby cries and a mother gasps in relief. It isn't power as lords define it, but it is power nonetheless. Even in the highest halls, queens wield influence. They advise kings, broker marriages, and occasionally seize thrones themselves. Eleanor of Aquitaine rides at the head of armies. Isabella of Castile negotiates treaties that will reshape continents. You can almost hear the chroniclers sigh, trying to box them into footnotes while their actions thunder louder than armies. And beyond the famous names, resilience blooms quietly. A widow runs her late husband's shop with sharp wit. A nun copies manuscripts, slipping her own reflections into the margins. A peasant woman plants seeds after plague, her calloused hands ensuring her children eat another winter. These are not grand gestures, but they are survival made sacred. The suffering of medieval women is undeniable: shackles of childbirth, violence, obedience, but threaded through it all is the stubborn truth: they endured. They laughed, they schemed, they sang lullabies, they wrote poems, they lit candles in chapels, they planted fields, and even when history tried to forget them, their presence lingers. In laws they forced to change, in families they kept alive, in stories we still uncover. So now, as the candles dim and the long tale draws to its close, you feel the heaviness soften. The Middle Ages were not kind to women, but women, in their own way, answered back, not always with swords, but with survival, and survival, in a world so eager to silence them, was its own kind of defiance. Your eyes grow heavy as the story slows, each detail fading like footprints into mist. The torches gutter out, the echoes of prayers and laughter slip into hush. The centuries fold like parchment, closing gently over the voices that carried so much pain, and yet so much quiet strength. And here, in this final moment, you breathe deeply, letting the weight dissolve. History becomes soft, almost tender, like a blanket tucked around you. The women of the Middle Ages suffered, but they also endured. And their endurance whispers still. A lullaby across time. You step softly into a dim chamber where a woman labors, her face pale, her hands gripping the sheets as though she could tear her way out of fate itself. The midwife whispers encouragement, her voice low but firm, while a priest waits nearby in case he must baptize the child, or If needed, offer last rites to the mother. It's the kind of scene repeated endlessly across the Middle Ages. Because childbirth, rather than being a moment of joy, was often a gamble between life and death. You feel the weight of that uncertainty pressing into the air, thicker than the smoke from the tallow candles. Pregnancy was celebrated, yes, but also feared. Everyone knew the odds. Many women would not survive labor. Hemorrhage, infection, breech births, any of these could end a life quickly. And there were no surgeons standing by with sterile gloves or epidurals ready to dull the pain. Just midwives with herbs, whispered prayers, and a mix of experience and desperation. You'd think bringing new life into the world should be empowering. In reality, it was like rolling dice with death at the table. And the house, spoiler alert, almost always had the advantage. Even queens weren't spared. Think of Isabella of France or Jane Seymour later in Tudor England, royalty. Surrounded by the best care available. Still cut down by complications. If noble women in silks were vulnerable, you can imagine how terrifying it was for peasants, who had fewer resources and even less privacy. A cramped cottage became a battlefield between the mother's endurance and the child's stubborn refusal to arrive smoothly. Sometimes both lost. Sometimes the baby lived, and the mother did not. Sometimes the opposite, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, neither survived, leaving families fractured and communities mourning. There were charms, of course. Amulets carved with saints' names. Relics laid across bellies. Whispered spells passed down through generations. One odd belief suggested tying the mother's girdle around a statue of the Virgin Mary and then untying it, hoping that symbolic loosening would ease the birth. Practical? Not really. But when blood began to flow and screams echoed against stone walls, any thread of hope was worth grasping. Historians still debate whether these rituals offered more comfort to the women themselves or to the panicking relatives hovering outside the door. The statistics, if you could gather them, would make you queasy. Some estimates suggest that up to 1 in 10 women might die from complications of childbirth during their lifetimes. Think about that. Every gathering of women in a village, every cluster of mothers at a market, carried invisible scars, daughters lost, friends buried, neighbors mourned. You wonder how anyone ever dared to get pregnant again. And yet they did, again and again, because survival of families, farms, and whole communities depended on it. Children weren't just blessings. They were insurance policies against the brutal arithmetic of mortality. And the babies? They weren't guaranteed safe passage either. Even after a mother survived labor, infants could die from infection, suffocation, or sheer fragility. That's why baptism often happened within hours of birth. No time for big christening parties when a child's survival was so uncertain. Priests literally stood in delivery rooms because the line between cradle and coffin was heartbreakingly thin. Parents grieved, yes, but they also steeled themselves. Because the loss was so common that mourning rituals blurred into everyday life. It's morbid to imagine, but for them, it was routine. Now picture a weary midwife walking home after another long night. Her hands smell of herbs. Her clothes stained with blood she cannot wash out. Her mind heavy with the faces of mothers she couldn't save. She knows she'll be called again tomorrow or next week. And she'll try again, whispering prayers and tightening bandages. Clinging to hope. In her quiet way, She's the unsung hero of this brutal lottery. No monuments were raised for midwives. No epics written in their honor. But entire generations survived only because of their stubborn persistence. Of course, not all births ended in tragedy. Some went smoothly, even joyfully. Mothers survived, children thrived, families expanded, but the shadow of risk never disappeared. And that shadow shaped how women lived their lives. Every pregnancy was a gamble. Every labor a trial. And each survivor carried not just a child in her arms, but a memory of the moment when she might have slipped away instead. The courage it took to face that repeatedly, year after year, deserves recognition far beyond the hushed margins of history books. So as you sit with the mother in this chamber, listening to her ragged breaths and the midwife's steady voice, you realize that this moment is not simply about pain, it's about resilience. Women endured, suffered, and often survived against odds that would make you back out of the delivery room in a heartbeat. The cost was high, yes, but it shaped families, societies, and the very rhythm of medieval life. And in this quiet, flickering room, you hear it. The rawest expression of both suffering and strength. You step away from the chamber of childbirth, but you don't get far before the smell of herbs and boiling water draws you toward another cottage. Inside, a woman leans over a table cluttered with dried plants, clay jars, and little pouches tied with twine. She is not a university-trained physician. Those were nearly always men. Locked away in Latin texts, but she is a healer. And in her hands lies knowledge passed down through whispers, practice, and sheer necessity. She knows which leaves calm a fever, which roots can soothe cramps, which teas might help coax milk for a newborn. It isn't glamorous medicine, it's muddy, bitter, sometimes guesswork, but for most of the medieval world, this was the only lifeline. Imagine a mother bringing in her child, cheeks flushed with sickness. The healer dips into her stores, producing a concoction that smells like hay mixed with vinegar. Does it cure the illness? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but in a world without antibiotics, even a little relief was priceless. She might recite a prayer over the cup, not just to sanctify the treatment but to reassure anxious parents that the divine was being consulted too. Medicine in these moments wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, emotional, communal. If you wanted sterile hospital walls and tidy pill bottles, well, you were several centuries too early. Midwives, too, carried immense responsibility. They weren't only delivering babies, they were delivering souls. If an infant slipped into the world lifeless, the midwife had to make split-second decisions, attempt to revive it, or, if not possible, perform an emergency baptism herself. Yes, you heard that right, midwives were often granted authority to baptize. Because the church feared unbaptized babies might drift to limbo. That's a lot of pressure when you're already trying to juggle screaming mothers, nosy neighbors, and the occasional goat sticking its head through the window. But here's the catch. Knowledge carried risk. The very expertise that made these women invaluable could also make them targets. If you could heal with herbs, people admired you, but if a neighbor's cow died the next week, suddenly you were a witch. If a baby lived, you were blessed. If it died, you were cursed. Some women walked that tightrope their entire lives, respected in daylight, whispered about in moonlight. The line between wise woman and witch was as thin as the parchment a monk might scribble on. And crossing it could mean interrogation, exile, or worse. One strange fact that historians note: some church manuals actually listed herbs women were forbidden to use, particularly those tied to contraception or abortion. The irony is deliciously dark. By writing down what not to use, they preserved the very knowledge they wanted to suppress. Imagine a monk muttering, "No one should ever boil pennyroyal in wine to prevent pregnancy," while some sharp-eared woman is thinking, "Ah, thank you for the recipe, Father." Scholars still debate whether these prohibitions were more effective at suppressing practices or spreading them accidentally. Herbal medicine wasn't just for humans either. Women tended animals, too, mixing salves for sheep or teas for sickly cows. Their work sustained entire households, often blending seamlessly into daily chores. Stirring a pot of porridge in the morning, stirring a pot of wormwood in the evening, it was all part of survival. Yet because their knowledge wasn't written in Latin or stored in universities, much of it has slipped through the cracks of history, leaving only tantalizing fragments. You almost wish you could taste one of those concoctions. Then again, given how often urine, ashes, or crushed insects made their way into remedies, maybe you'd prefer to admire from a safe distance. The midwife's presence also meant community. They were trusted, often loved, sometimes feared, but always needed. They showed up when babies arrived, when fevers spiked, when despair knocked. In a society where women were barred from most formal power, healers and midwives carved out authority through skill and necessity. Their voices might not echo in chronicles, but they echoed in every household that survived because of their care. And you can sense it, even as suspicion lingers. Even as clerics frown, these women carried a quiet defiance. They worked in kitchens, gardens, and birthing rooms, wielding power that no knight's sword could match, the power to sustain life. In a time when medicine often did more harm than good, leeches. Anyone? The village midwife with her bundle of herbs might have been the closest thing to hope. So as you step back from the cottage, the smell of sage still clinging to your clothes, you realize something simple. Medieval women were healers not just because they wanted to be, but because they had to be. And in the face of suspicion, hardship, and danger, they kept at it anyway, an act of quiet, stubborn courage written not in books, but in the lives they saved. You step away from the herbalist's cottage, and the path leads you into fields buzzing with flies and the soft clatter of wooden tools. Here is where women spent much of their lives, not in illuminated manuscripts or royal courts, but bent under the weight of labor that seemed to have no end. Sunrise to sunset, and often long after, the rhythm of their existence was an exhausting dance between field, hearth, and family. Picture it: a woman rising before dawn, fumbling in the dark to stoke a stubborn fire from last night's embers. She kneads coarse bread with arms already sore from yesterday, while a baby wails on her hip and older children squabble over scraps. As the first light creeps through the cracks of a wooden shutter, she steps outside, not for leisure, but to tether animals, milk a cow, or drag water from a well so deep you'd swear it was designed by a medieval gym trainer. Seriously, who needs CrossFit when you're hauling buckets of icy water twice your weight before breakfast? And when that's done, fields await. Women didn't just sweep floors, they sowed grain, harvested wheat, dug potatoes, when they finally arrived from the New World centuries later, tended vineyards, and carried bundles heavier than most modern gym-goers could handle. Imagine trudging through muddy furrows with a sickle, your back bent in the sun, knowing that tomorrow you'll do the exact same thing. Historians sometimes like to debate whether women's farm labor was seasonal or occasional. Sure, maybe in textbooks. In reality, it was daily survival. You can almost hear the dry laughter of a peasant wife reading that line. Occasional? Come grind this barley and then talk to me. Inside the house, it was no lighter. Cooking wasn't tossing pasta into boiling water, it was grinding grain. Making cheese, preserving meats, brewing ale, spinning wool, weaving cloth, sewing clothes, and mending every single thing until it frayed into oblivion. Laundry? Forget washing machines, imagine lugging piles of filthy linen to a river. Scrubbing until your knuckles bled. Then dragging it all back home to dry. Oh, and don't forget tending to sick relatives. Delivering babies. And somehow keeping children alive in a world where half of them might not reach adulthood. One strange fact: in some villages, women were so central to brewing ale that the word alewife became common. These women brewed beer not as a hobby but as a household staple, because water wasn't always safe. And beer, low alcohol, mind you, was daily hydration. But when brewing became profitable, men swooped in, pushing women out of what was once their domain. Classic history move: women do the labor. Men monetize it. You sense the monotony, but also the resilience. Each task bled into the next, stitched together like the endless thread from a spindle. And through it all, humor slipped in where it could. Imagine a group of women gathered at a riverbank, scrubbing laundry but also gossiping, laughing, maybe teasing each other about whose husband snores the loudest. The labor never ended, but laughter, quiet, sharp, defiant, made it just bearable enough. Yet, under the weight of this constant toil was an undeniable inequality. Men's work in the fields or trades was seen as productive, while women's equally back-breaking labor was often dismissed as merely household duty. Historians still argue about the exact boundaries of male and female roles. But the truth is plain: women worked just as hard, often harder, but recognition rarely followed. If the Middle Ages had performance reviews, women's contributions would be listed as miscellaneous. You watch as the day stretches into dusk. The same woman who rose before dawn now kneels again at the hearth, stirring a pot while children drowse against her skirts. Her hands are cracked, her back bent, but she keeps moving because if she stops, the fragile balance of survival collapses. No applause, no medals, no days off, just the quiet grind of keeping life going. And as you leave the glow of the firelight behind, you realize, in the Middle Ages, women didn't simply live through suffering, they carried entire households on their shoulders. Invisible to history books but undeniable in reality. Their labor was endless, their resilience immeasurable, and their endurance, frankly, superhuman. You probably wouldn't last a week. You step away from the fields, your ears still filled with the steady hum of sickles and gossiping women. And suddenly you find yourself in a stone cloister. The air here is cooler, heavy with incense and silence. and the only sound is the shuffle of sandals against worn floors. This is where women who sought refuge, or were pushed, found themselves bound not by husbands or fields, but by vows that shaped every breath. Picture a young girl, maybe 12 or 13, led into a convent by her family. Sometimes she arrived willingly, her eyes wide with visions of saints and heaven. Other times, she had no choice, her dowry too small, her family unwilling to marry her off. So the cloister became her fate. The heavy wooden doors closed behind her, and from that moment, her life belonged not to herself, but to God, or at least to the abbess and the strict rhythm of the convent. Her day was carved into hours of prayer, work, and silence, midnight prayers in freezing chapels, dawn chants with voices still cracking from sleep, and endless hours copying texts or embroidering altar cloths by candlelight. If you've ever thought your office meetings were long, try chanting psalms for hours in Latin you barely understand. At least you don't have to hum Gregorian tones before breakfast. And yet, the convent wasn't just a place of worship. It was also a cage. Rules dictated every aspect. No vanity. No laughter too loud. No private possessions. Even letters from family could be restricted. Some convents were so strict that nuns could only speak through grills, never seeing outsiders except through narrow lattices. Imagine living your entire adult life behind walls. Your world shrunk to a handful of corridors, a garden, and a chapel. One curious fact, despite the restrictions, convents sometimes became centers of female power. An abbess could wield more authority than most married women ever dreamed of, overseeing lands, rents, and even advising nobles. Some convents ran schools for girls, preserving knowledge in places where the outside world often dismissed women's education. But this power came with chains, authority within strict limits, always shadowed by bishops and male clergy. And still, whispers of rebellion lingered. Records tell of nuns sneaking food, smuggling letters, or resisting unwanted vows. Some even attempted escape, slipping out at night with the help of sympathetic villagers. Others quietly bent rules, singing folk songs in kitchens, planting herbs that doubled as medicine and flavoring forbidden stews. Life, even within walls, found ways to leak through cracks. Historians debate how much freedom convent life offered compared to marriage. Was it liberation from the brutality of childbirth and endless toil? Or simply another kind of prison? The answer shifts depending on which nun you ask, or perhaps depending on which historian you corner over coffee. What's clear is that for many women, the convent was less about divine calling and more about social necessity. The least bad option in a world of limited choices. You picture a cloister at dusk. A line of women in indigo habits moving silently toward the chapel. Candles trembling in their hands. Their faces are pale, some serene, some haunted. Behind them, gardens bloom quietly, lavender, sage, roses climbing ancient walls. Beauty exists here, but always muted, controlled, channeled toward devotion, and as the chapel doors close, you feel the weight of vows pressing down, not just on their voices, but on their entire lives. And you realize, in the Middle Ages, even choosing God came with suffering. The convent could shelter, it could empower, but it could also suffocate. For many women, the cloister was both sanctuary and sentence, a paradox carved in stone and prayer. You leave the cool hush of the cloister, stepping back into the uneven light of a medieval town square, where the clang of coins and the shuffle of merchants' feet remind you that power wasn't only prayed for, it was counted, tallied, written into law. And here, you see another layer of women's suffering, the invisible shackles of property and inheritance. Imagine this. A woman inherits a small field after her father's death. She has tilled the soil, gathered the harvest, maybe even managed accounts while her brothers were off at war. But the moment she tries to claim ownership, a clerk with a smug grin and a quill scratches a note in the margin, held in trust by her husband or male guardian. Just like that, the land is hers in name only. Talk about being the star of the play but never getting your name on the poster. In much of medieval Europe, women's legal identities were absorbed into their husbands. The concept was even given a name in later centuries: coverture, a polite way of saying, "Congrats, you exist only through your man." Widows fared slightly better. Some could inherit and manage estates. But even then, their autonomy was often temporary. The moment they remarried, property slipped through their fingers like sand. And yet, contradictions abound. In places like certain Italian city-states, widows sometimes became powerful patrons, funding churches or commissioning art. In England, wealthy heiresses were hot commodities, practically fought over in political marriages. A noble woman with land could sway entire alliances. But don't let the glamour fool you, the power was fragile. One wrong step, one forced marriage, and it all could vanish. Here's a curious detail. Some women tried to outmaneuver the system with clever loopholes. A widow might gift property to her son before remarrying. Or a savvy merchant's wife could smuggle her savings into the hands of a trusted relative, keeping a sliver of independence. Historians still debate how widespread these quiet rebellions were, but the legal records are sprinkled with odd little transfers that hint at women's ingenuity. You picture a market stall, saffron robes swishing as a widow counts coins. Her hands firm, her eyes sharper than the merchants around her. She knows every coin is a fight, against law, against custom, against the slow erosion of her rights. And across the square, a clerk in russet ink scribbles her name, then adds a note, to be held by her brother. Her jaw tightens. But she doesn't argue. Not here, not now. Survival often meant silence. Even noblewomen weren't spared. Think of Eleanor of Aquitaine, brilliant, wealthy, politically savvy, and yet, even she was imprisoned for years by her husband. Her vast duchy treated like an annex to his power. If someone that powerful could be shackled, what chance did the miller's wife or the cobbler's daughter have? And still, you find resilience in the cracks. Records of petitions written by women to kings, complaints lodged in courts, and testaments where mothers left jewelry, household items, or even livestock specifically to daughters, thumbing their noses at restrictive laws. Tiny acts of defiance, folded into parchment and sealed with trembling hands. As you walk away from the square, the sound of coins still echoing in your ears, you feel the weight of a truth. In the Middle Ages, women's labor built households, their dowries propped up estates, their hands held communities together, but when it came to law, they were ghosts, acknowledged only in the shadows of men's names. You step into a smoky cottage where herbs dangle from rafters and the air smells of garlic. rosemary, and something vaguely like burnt onions. Here, you meet the so-called healers, women who mixed poultices, whispered charms, and stitched wounds when no physician would step near a sickbed. And yet, in a cruel twist, the very women who kept neighbors alive often became the scapegoats when healing failed. Picture this: a village racked by fever. A woman presses a poultice of crushed sage to a child's brow, prays quietly, and waits. Sometimes the fever breaks, sometimes it doesn't. If the child lives, she's a saint. If the child dies, she's a witch. You can't win when your reputation swings on the flip of a fever coin. Honestly, it's like being Yelp reviewed by fate itself. Medieval medicine itself wasn't kind to women. The prevailing theory of humors treated their bodies as colder, wetter, and therefore weaker than men's. Physicians, educated mostly in Latin texts written by men, often described women as imperfect men. Charming, right? Women's health was routinely dismissed. And remedies could be as bizarre as rubbing pigeon droppings on the skin or drinking potions made from powdered gemstones. You can almost hear medieval women muttering, "Can't I just have some chicken soup?" And then came the darker turn, the witch hunts. Although the most infamous trials peaked in the early modern period, their seeds were sown in the late Middle Ages. A healer who used too many charms, a widow who lived alone, or a midwife whose patient died in childbirth, all could be accused. Records show women dragged before local courts, accused of consorting with demons, when all they'd really done was deliver a baby or gather herbs at dusk. Here's the strange detail: not all accusations were fear-driven. Sometimes they were political, or even personal. A neighbor wanted your field? Call her a witch. A rival jealous of your wool dyeing business? Whisper she sold her soul for that brilliant teal. Historians still debate whether economic envy or genuine superstition fueled more of these cases. Either way, women bore the brunt. You see it now. A midwife in saffron robes kneeling, clutching a rosary, while a magistrate frowns over parchment filled with accusations. The villagers murmur, half terrified, half thrilled, because nothing binds a community like a convenient scapegoat. And yet, despite all this, women persisted. Some kept healing in secret, passing recipes from mother to daughter, herbs tucked into hidden pockets of memory. Others leaned into the label of wise woman, demanding respect through knowledge too valuable to ignore. In some cases, even skeptical priests admitted they relied on these women when illness spread. You leave the smoky cottage and the echo of those whispered prayers clings to you. In the Middle Ages, women's bodies were both battleground and evidence. Their knowledge celebrated one moment and condemned the next. Healing and harming blurred together in the minds of frightened people and women. Caught in the middle, paid the price. You find yourself standing at the threshold of a dim chamber. The air thick with the smell of wax, sweat, and faintly sour linens. A midwife crouches at the bedside, hands steady but eyes wary, while a young woman gasps through another contraction. This is childbirth in the Middle Ages, not a celebration of new life so much as a gamble with death. And honestly, you'd probably rather bet on medieval dice games. At least those odds weren't 1 in 3. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments in a woman's life. No sterilization, no anesthesia, No obstetric tools beyond whatever the midwife carried in a small bundle of cloth. A labor that lasted too long could easily become a death sentence. Even if the child survived, the mother might not, and vice versa, and when both perished, the village would chalk it up to God's will, which is basically medieval shorthand for, we have no idea what went wrong. Midwives held an uneasy position in this drama. They were trusted for their knowledge, passed down orally, but also feared for their power over such mysterious events. They prayed alongside women, murmuring invocations to saints, while slipping herbs into potions, pennyroyal, mugwort, and others that historians now know could be both remedies and poisons. If the birth went well, they were praised. If it didn't, they risked whispers of witchcraft or incompetence. You almost feel bad for them, like being the tech support of medieval life. Blamed when the system crashes no matter how hard you tried. And the statistics are grim. Some regions saw maternal mortality rates so high that women wrote their wills before labor. Imagine that. Preparing for childbirth the way you'd prepare for battle. Families lined the chamber walls, waiting, praying, clutching relics and charms. Some women begged for holy water or even the last rites while still alive. Just in case, infant mortality was no kinder. Even after surviving delivery, babies faced diseases, malnutrition, and accidents. It's why baptism happened so quickly. Often within hours of birth, the church feared the infant might not survive long enough for a proper ceremony later. A mother might cradle her newborn, only to hand it immediately to a priest for water on the forehead. The joy of new life was shadowed by the constant presence of death. Here's the strange detail. Women developed elaborate rituals to cope. Amulets were hung over cradles. Prayers whispered at dawn. Saints invoked for protection. One saint, Margaret of Antioch, was believed to aid women in labor because she herself had once burst from the belly of a dragon. Not exactly textbook obstetrics, but hey, when you're desperate, any patron saint will do. And of course, not everyone viewed childbirth with the same reverence. Noble women sometimes gave birth surrounded by attendants, priests, and physicians, their chambers draped in saffron cloth and filled with relics. Peasant women, by contrast, often worked in fields until labor struck, giving birth in a corner of their home, then returning to work days later. The social divide shaped not just the experience but the risks. Nobles sometimes suffered from too many interventions. Peasants from too few. You stand now in that chamber, watching as the midwife lifts a squalling newborn, the mother pale but breathing, relief flooding the room. A priest steps forward with holy water, and the family weeps with joy. Yet outside, in another cottage, another woman lies silent, her child still, her family grieving. That duality, the constant dance of life and death, was the rhythm of medieval motherhood. And you realize, to be a woman in the Middle Ages meant carrying not just children, but the weight of risk, hope, and grief in equal measure. You step into a village lane at twilight, the thatched roofs glowing faintly under the last streaks of sun. A woman walks slowly ahead of you, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She is not young, not old, just marked. Marked by absence, by the space where a husband once walked beside her. In the Middle Ages, widowhood was both a sorrow and, oddly, a doorway, Imagine losing your partner, the person who shared your bread and fire, and then discovering that your entire role in society has shifted overnight. For many women, widowhood meant vulnerability. Without a man, property rights could become slippery. Lords might swoop in, trying to claim land, neighbors might whisper about remarriage, and families could jostle for control. Some widows were forced into convents. Their grief folded neatly into prayer and silence. Others remarried quickly, whether they wanted to or not, because survival often required attaching oneself to another household. And yet, here's the twist. Widowhood sometimes offered more independence than marriage ever did. A widow could run her husband's workshop, sell goods in the market, or manage a farm in her own name. Records show widows brewing ale, hiring laborers, even suing in court. For a society that often treated women as extensions of their husbands. This was a crack in the wall, a narrow gap through which a measure of autonomy slipped. It's like life handed them lemons and they opened a small, surprisingly profitable tavern. But it wasn't simple freedom. Grief hung heavy, especially when children were involved. Picture a mother with 3 little ones clinging to her skirts, trying to harvest fields alone, bargaining at markets with a stern face she doesn't feel. Some widows leaned on kin, others leaned on prayer, and some, though rarely admitted, simply struggled on the brink of poverty. Historians still debate whether widows were pitied, respected, or quietly feared for their independence. Likely, it was all three, depending on the village gossip that week. And superstition never lingered far. A widow who managed too well could be accused of witchcraft. After all, how else could she thrive without a man? Some were dragged into courts, their strength twisted into suspicion. Others, more fortunate, were admired as pillars of resilience. Proof that women could weather storms alone. You watch as the woman ahead pauses at her cottage door. She lights a small lamp, the glow spilling out into the lane. Inside, her table is modest but hers. The bread she baked with her own hands. The fields tomorrow that she will tend with her own labor. Grief walks beside her, but so does a quiet pride. And you realize, in widowhood, medieval women discovered a paradox. They were both diminished and enlarged by loss. Without their husbands, they faced uncertainty, yet they also carved out spaces of independence that whispered of possibilities beyond the roles society tried to lock them into. The hum of a marketplace rises around you now, clattering stalls. The smell of salted fish. The crunch of boots on straw. You notice something curious. It isn't only men calling out prices or measuring grain. Women stand behind counters too. Their voices sharp as coins clink and change hands. Work, after all, has always been about survival. And in the Middle Ages, women's labor was everywhere, even if it rarely earned the recognition or the wages it deserved. Take the fields, for instance. Women bent their backs beside men during planting and harvest, hauling sheaves of wheat until their arms burned. Yet when the Lord tallied up the payments, guess whose coins were smaller? Women often earned half, sometimes a third, of what men received for the same sweat. It's like clocking in at your modern office, doing the exact same spreadsheets, and being paid in coupons for stale bread. And yet, without women, much of the rural economy would have collapsed. They milked cows, spun wool, brewed ale, tended vegetable plots, carried water, baked bread, and stitched clothes. Medieval homes were basically microfactories, with women as the tireless machinery. A single bad winter could tip a family into ruin, and women's endless cycle of chores often stood between hunger and survival. Some women went further, stepping into crafts. In towns, widows frequently inherited their husbands' guild memberships. Imagine a blacksmith's wife, once sweeping ashes from the forge, now hammering iron herself while apprentices glance nervously, unsure whether to laugh or obey. There are records of female brewers, parchment makers, and even surgeons, though the guilds often tried to shove them back into the margins. Historians still debate whether guilds tolerated or resented these women, but the evidence shows they could not easily be erased. And then came the plague, reshaping everything. Labor shortages suddenly gave workers bargaining power, and women's roles stretched wider. Some became landlords of abandoned cottages. Others took up trades no one expected, running taverns, selling cloth, or managing estates. But as soon as populations recovered, laws tried to squeeze them back down. England's Statute of Labourers, for example, attempted to freeze wages and restrict mobility. But peasants, men and women alike, simply walked to the next employer. Picture a medieval HR department tearing its hair out. Still, the bias was relentless. Women were often accused of stealing men's jobs if they stepped outside domestic spheres. Though the truth is they had always worked, just invisibly. A medieval proverb went, "A woman's work is never done." And it wasn't meant as a joke. It was a weary recognition that dawned to dusk. Their hands shaped survival. You pass a group of women gathered in a courtyard, beating laundry against wooden troughs, their laughter bubbling between the slaps of wet cloth. Despite the aches, there is solidarity here, a rhythm of shared burden. Work was hard, wages were unfair, but community gave it a softer edge. And you realize, medieval women's labor wasn't simply about coin. It was the pulse that kept families alive, the glue that bound villages, the invisible scaffolding of an entire world. Underpaid, overlooked, yet essential. Without them, the Middle Ages would have unraveled long before plague or war could touch it. The noise of the market drifts away. And now the world around you grows quiet again. You feel the weight of centuries pressing in, not as a roar, but as a whisper. The women of the Middle Ages, queens and peasants, nuns and midwives, servants and merchants, fade like figures at dusk. But their echoes linger in every stone wall, every faded parchment, every lullaby carried forward. Think back to the burdens they carried: childbirth without medicine, marriages arranged for profit, fields bent over for half a man's wage, whispers of witchcraft whenever they stepped too far. Their suffering shaped the world, not because it was rare, but because it was constant, woven into daily life like threads in coarse linen. And yet, within that suffering was resilience. Fierce and quiet, they endured, they adapted, they whispered stories to daughters, passing on strength even when hope was thin. Historians still debate how much power women truly held, whether through queenship, through convent walls, or through markets that relied on their labor. But power isn't always the crown on a brow. It is also the calloused hands that keep children fed, the whispered prayers that hold communities together, the laughter stolen beside riverbanks when no one is watching. Their legacy is not just hardship, but the persistence of life against every odds stacked against them. As the centuries unfold, you see how memory reshapes. Myths of saintly women who resisted with faith. Tales of witches punished for daring to heal. Chronicles of queens praised or scorned. Each retelling blurs truth with fear, devotion, or gossip, but the heart of it remains. Women bore the heaviest burdens, and their endurance carved deep lines into the story of humanity. Now, let the images soften. Picture not the flames of accusation or the cries of labor, but the gentler scenes. A mother humming over a cradle, a nun illuminating a manuscript by candlelight, a young girl stealing a moment to laugh under summer sun. These fragments are the threads that bind past to present, reminders that suffering was never the whole of their story. And so, as you drift deeper into quiet, feel the edges blur, the markets, the chapels, the castles, the cottages, let them dissolve into mist, leaving only calm. The voices of the women fade, not in silence, but in a steady rhythm, like waves on a shore. Their story is both a scar and a lullaby. And tonight it settles over you like a soft blanket. Breathe slowly now. Let the weight of history lift from your shoulders. The bells no longer toll. The torches no longer burn. The questions no longer press. Only rest remains. End of script. Sweet dreams.